3:05. So officially starting. So this is the Fil-Am Paths to Neuroscience, one of the first webinars in the Career Path series in AFSA. So these are all going to be neuroscience stories. Some housekeeping. So the recording is going to be recorded. This webinar is recorded and will be shared afterwards if you missed anything or want to share it. Questions can be sent via the Q&A portion of the webinar. And if you're live tweeting, please also tag AFSA so we can recognize that you were here and you enjoyed it. These are our 4 speakers for today. I'm going to let them actually introduce themselves because it's a lot, and then you'll also see the information according for each person while they introduce themselves. So I think Jess can start it off as first, and we'll see hers first.
Sure, yeah. Hi, I'm Jessica Noche Lingad. I am a 4th-year graduate student here at UC Irvine in California, and I am in the lab of Craig Stark. I study neuroimaging biomarkers that help identify neuroinflammation in the brain and how that relates to memory decline in older adults and also in Alzheimer's disease. I also wrote here that I'm an NSF graduate research fellow. I mostly like to advertise this because I like to mentor students who want to apply to give them strategies for tips for how to write and build their application. And I'm very passionate about community outreach and mentorship, which is one main reason why I'm here.
Okay, next up, Dr. Murray.
Hi, Pete Murray. I got my PhD at the University of Maryland in Baltimore. Studied gene expression, the signaling between TrkB, BDNF, neurotrophin signaling in the brain related to memory. And then for my postdoc, I switched over to systems neuroscience, where we were measuring maladaptive plasticity changes in the thalamus following a spinal cord injury model for central pain syndrome. And my last project there was looking at the motor cortex and how somatosensory information incoming into the motor cortex was processed to help guide movement. And so that was in the lab of Asaf Keller, also at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. And then I left academia and became an administrator. I went into grants management. I worked for the DoD, where I was the Army's pain portfolio manager. And then this past December, I jumped ship again from one Fed to another. Now I'm at the NIH, where I'm at the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, also looking over mostly their pain portfolio, which comprises about 40% of the center's portfolio.
Up next is Rose. You can introduce yourself.
Hi, I am Rose de Guzman. I am a postdoctoral fellow currently at Massachusetts General Hospital. I got my bachelor's in nutritional biochemistry at UC Davis. And I was really interested in longevity and also how nutrition influences how long you live. And so I just wanted to really know how we can live longer and also healthier. But toward the end of my bachelor's, I figured, well, you can have a healthy body, but your mind also needs to be healthy as well. And so I joined a neuroscience lab at UCLA. So I moved from Davis to UCLA. I was there for a few years and then got my PhD at University of Albany in New York in behavioral neuroscience, where I really wanted to understand the mechanisms that might be regulating postpartum stress response, specifically sex differences between males and females. And I just am really passionate about learning about maternal and infant neurohealth. And so after I got my PhD from UAlbany, I then moved to Boston, and I'm now at Massachusetts General Hospital, where I am continuing on learning how maternal health and maternal immune activation influences fetal and infant neurodevelopment. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least.
Hi, I'm Brandy Briones, and I recently just defended my PhD work woohoo, from Princeton University, and I was in the joint degree program for psychology and neuroscience. I sort of had two projects that were connected by looking at perineuronal nets. It's an extracellular matrix structure that surrounds certain cell type interneurons in the hippocampus and the striatum and across the brain, because I felt like it was important to look not only at neurons in the brain and how those function, but also how these different extracellular matrix components might support plasticity of these neurons in the brain. And so I looked at the hippocampus and investigated adult neurogenesis, so the formation of new neurons in the hippocampus during adulthood. And then also looked at it in the striatum of mouse models that represented autism spectrum disorder type behavioral phenotypes, so excessive repetitive behaviors and sort of these behaviors that are rote and can't be like stopped easily. And I just put a little bit of information in my bio about my background. So I'm half Filipina, and I'm also part Salvadoran Papilis, and also some American, like European mix all in there. So I have a lot of different background influences. And then I will be wrapping up here at Princeton and moving to Seattle starting October in Garrett Stuber's lab, and I'll be focusing on sex differences in lateral habenula and how stress and reward circuits might be sculpted by sex steroid hormones.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing the info for now because we're going to focus on the speakers. So I think Rose touched on this in her introduction, but we're just going to explain kind of what are your interests, what did you study in undergrad, how have you kind of determined that you want to study neuroscience, and then at the professional level. And anyone can start if you'd like, and then you can pass the mic as you go.
I can start. So I came into undergrad the pre-nursing major, no surprise there, but it's because my mom is an RN, and I perceive her as very successful to be able to raise us. You know, she's a single parent, and there's 3 of us, and we're all college age at the same time. So I thought that was an awesome career. But going into it, I immediately realized it wasn't for me, and I switched to psychology. Also during that time, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, but I did consider going into some sort of, therapist type of career. But then I took a course at UC Irvine on learning theory, and I thought that was really interesting. How does the brain learn and retain information? And, just the fact that memory makes us who we are. Without our memories, who would we even be? And I learned this a little bit the hard way because my grandmother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. So and she lived with us, so I saw her kind of slowly, wither away, I guess you can say. And I started to get really interested in understanding how Alzheimer's disease works. So I pursued joining a neuroscience laboratory at UC Irvine, and I really loved learning about the brain in general and just learning about this disease and the fact that there are no treatments at all for it to slow or stop the disease. And I find that I have a lot of passion for being in this field, so I decided to pursue graduate training in this, and that is how I landed here.
So I guess I can go next. Yeah, I had kind of an indirect course myself. It's really interesting that you can finish college and still not really kind of know where you want to go. I was always into science. I was always into biology. So I graduated from University of Maryland, College Park with a degree in general biology. But then I worked for a pharmaceutical company, and it was pretty boring. I was kind of a technician. And then a position opened up at the University of Maryland, also a technician position. And so I'm sitting there cleaning glassware and going to some of the seminars, but it was a neuroscience lab. And I realized, I was like, this is it. This is my love that's been there all along. And I just didn't know it. And I'm like, I want to get into this neuroscience program. And, things worked out. And, I never looked back. I mean, my wife's an immunologist, and I had other friends who were studying cancer. And I told them that their science is inferior to mine because, their fields look at cells and maybe organs and systems, but neuroscience goes from, genetics to the cell to systems to, culture and society. And it's just so fascinating and so vast. And really, we don't know how the brain works. It's complicated. And so it's just fascinating. It's mysterious. It's spiritual. It's all that. So that's how I got into neuroscience.
That's awesome. I guess we'll go through that same order. Yeah, that's one of the things I love about neuroscience is the interdisciplinary aspect of it. All fields have something and we can all connect and understand the brain even more. My journey started, I actually talked about this on Being Neuroscientists. It started with my little brother, my youngest brother. So my family and I were separated for about 10 years or so. And by the time I was at a junior college, we all then moved to California. And during that time, my mom became pregnant with my youngest brother. And I was just really interested in nutrition and child development. I was taking classes at the junior college during that time. And I used what I learned from those classes to then help my mom. What can we eat? And then from like the toys that he could play with, I got him this caterpillar toy with the legs are like different letters. And at one point he just started like saying the letters. I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. And so I'm always just really interested in child development, but I was also intrigued by nutrition. So that's how I got nutritional biochemistry at Davis. And then as I mentioned earlier, it was toward the end, my very, very last semester when I took an aging class, and that was when it all clicked. I was like, okay, well, I need to learn about the brain as well if I want to know and learn about the body holistically. And so I then went to UCLA for a few years at a neuro lab, but it was more of artificial intelligence type of thing. And I really wanted to know more of the biological aspect of neuroscience. So I went to UAlbany, where we then studied how hormones might be influencing the specific brain cell population that is sexually dimorphic. It's evident it's highly expressed in female brains, but nearly absent in male brains. Now, there is this sex difference in prevalence of depression and anxiety and stress response. And so I then wanted to learn how we could then protect the mother during pregnancy and during postpartum, because during that time, it not only affects the mom, but it also affects the infant. So now in Boston, I am looking how neural or immune activation of the mom affects the placenta, fetal development, and also infant development.
That's really cool. It's nice because it kind of like ties in what I'm gonna also be sort of looking at as a postdoc. Yeah, we can collaborate. It'll be great. So it's funny. The first thing I think about when, or that comes to mind when I'm asked like about my path to neuroscience is when I was younger, we did this thing in high school and like middle school and elementary school called science fair. And I absolutely hated it. I thought it was awful. And little did I know that's what I was going to be doing for like the rest of my life is just extended science fair. But I think because the reason I didn't like it is because I felt like, well, what questions would I even be able to answer with like what I have available to me? And I really didn't have much available to me. So my very first science fair experiment was to grow plants and play different types of music for each plant to see how it might affect them. And I didn't start early enough to actually have the plants grow significantly. And so each one just only kind of sprouted like a small sprout. But in any case, that was sort of my first experience with like thinking, like having a hypothesis driven like question and how to go about that. And so fast forward, I got to UCLA and I decided first that I was going to do biochemistry. I really liked chemistry in high school and I thought it was really interesting. But then looking at the course selection at UCLA for biochemistry, I sort of didn't see any classes that spoke to me or that seemed like it had more of a like broader, more integrative approach to science. And so that's what really drew me to psychobiology at UCLA. And you could get from all different levels, what everybody's kind of been touching on is that you can go from the bottom to the top and you can span looking at the molecular level, the cellular level, circuit behavior. And so I really liked that. And if it weren't for this program called Peers at UCLA, it's a program for excellence in education for research in the sciences. If it weren't for that program, I just on a whim decided to join it. And that actually is what just influenced me to start this path in research. Otherwise, like similar to Jessica, I was going pre-med because, you know, my family was like, oh, you should be a nurse, you should be a doctor, like, why not try that? So I was pre-med originally, and I worked at the UCLA Santa Monica Hospital and the UCLA Westwood Hospital for some time, and it was not for me. I was so overwhelmed by just how much was going on and just so much respect for anyone who works in the medical field. It's such a respectful profession, and it's very hard on the body and the mind. And I thought that I would be better suited to contribute to that from the research side. And so I joined a lab that focused on post-traumatic stress disorder because I myself have struggled with like anxiety and depression. And so I wanted to understand more from like the cell and biology level, like what might be happening to like our brains to predisposition us to that. So that was really great. And then I also joined this nonprofit organization called Active Minds that also looks at like mental health education and mental health support on college campuses. And from there, yeah, it just like really took off and I really enjoyed research. The Peers program helped guide along the way of how to study for a GRE. I don't like standardized tests. I didn't study at all for the SAT. I felt like, again, what do I do with this information? It doesn't mean anything to me. Anyways, so without that, I probably wouldn't have been able to even apply for the number of grad schools that I did. I just didn't have the money at the time to pay for like application fees. And so it was really nice that they paid for that. And yeah, so then I got into Princeton and I was just like, wow, I can't believe this is happening, moving across the entire country to start grad school. And yeah, I had a really great PhD mentor. And so now that's how I got to where I'm at now.
Very cool. Okay, now that you all have had different kinds of backgrounds that have led you to neuroscience, you're probably going to have different types of careers. So what would you describe a typical day in the life for like all of you in terms of like student, postdoc life, in admin industry? So again, whoever wants to start can start and then pass the mic as you feel. If you want to follow the same order, feel free.
Okay, yeah, we can keep the same order. So the day in the life for me, right now I'm analyzing a data set. So what that means is I've had to learn a lot of skills that I never thought I'd ever be able to learn. So coming from a background of psychology, I never thought a person in psychology who was like notoriously bad at math. But right now I'm doing signal processing, and I'm doing a lot of computational work. I learned how to program in Python, and you know, all these advanced things. And it seems like, I mean, 2014 me would never ever guess I would be at this point. But you know, working every day towards this, you're just chipping away little by little. So you know, seeing where graduate students are, it can be intimidating because you can't like picture yourself in that position. But you know, we learn a little bit every day. Coding, I'm still not that great at coding, but you know, I try to pick it up here and there and to work towards my project. Another thing that I do as a graduate student is, you know, you're constantly trying to stay up to date on the literature in the area that you're in. So you tend to start to get pretty tunnel visioned into what topic you're looking at. Because neuroscience can be, like what everyone has said, it can be so broad, but you're expected to be an expert. So with a PhD, by the end of it, you're supposed to defend a thesis of something that has never been discovered before, or has you know, never been looked at in the way that you're looking at it. So that feels like you know, a huge undertaking, but you know, over the course of the 5 years, you're learning so much every day. So yeah, it's a great position to be in as a PhD student, because as you're considered, you know, a trainee, you're also doing science. This is not a simulation, people. Like, I'm actually doing real research, and you know, under my PI, my advisor, who gets funding from, you know, the federal government, from the NIH. And so I think that's one thing a lot of people don't really realize about a PhD. They just think, oh, I'm gonna be sitting behind a desk for another 5-6 years taking tests and etc. But no, you're actually, you know, in the field doing really cool things. So yeah, that's where I'm at right now, analyzing data and hopefully gonna understand something about the brains that I'm looking at.
So I'm actually doing simulation science, because I'm not doing science myself, but I'm involved in the science that other people are conducting. So at the NIH, you know, the typical day is just meetings and meetings. If half of the hours are to myself and meeting free, it's a joyous day, because we really have lots of meetings. We have 3 funding cycles per year. All of these applications come in, and you have applications in your portfolio. You look at them, which ones are going forward because they scored well. And then, so you work with your center, you work with the PIs to prepare their documents and so forth. But at the same time, so that, you know, that cycle resets 3 times a year. So you're always involved with that. And you know, these meetings, you meet with your team to gain consensus on the portfolio, and that's your small team. And then once that consensus is reached, you meet with the larger division, and then finally the director. So these meetings are, you know, always gaining consensus at different levels of the hierarchy. On top of that, we're always talking to PIs, you know, this funding mechanism. I want to know if my idea fits with this funding mechanism. And I work in the clinical trials branch. And so we actually, probably one of the most enjoyable parts of my job is actually sitting down with the PIs on Zoom and talking about their study design, you know, the smaller scale pilot studies to prepare for the larger studies. Are they asking the right questions? You know, are they sufficiently powered to do this to answer these questions and so forth? So that's really a fun and very interesting part of the job. And then on top of that, you know, right now we have strategic planning at my center going on. We do it once every 5 years. And so you take a look at the different parts of the portfolio. I work for the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. So I went from the Army looking at how to, you know, handle pain on the battlefield, which is a very acute traumatic experience. And so right now it's just pretty powerful opioids, to mindfulness and acupuncture and yoga. So it's a really different environment. So anyway, you know, you look at the pain portfolio, the mind-body intervention portfolio, the natural products portfolio. What have we done over the last 5 years? What areas have we succeeded? What areas are there still research gaps? And so then we can plan the next 5 years. So there's so many things going on, and that's why there are so many meetings going on. So sometimes you have to wake up pretty early if you want any time to yourself. But it's busy. It's incredibly intelligent and hardworking people. It's a dynamic environment, a lot of fun.
Amazing. I went back to lab, or I finally got access to lab 3 weeks ago. Yes, 3 weeks ago. But during that time, so I joke with my family and friends that I started my postdoc sprinting, because I had 2 weeks before the senior postdoc was leaving, and I would then become the only postdoc in lab. And so I pretty much had to learn all of the techniques, and just like a really steep learning curve. I chose this lab because I don't have any experience at all in any of the techniques that they are doing. And so it's just been a wild journey for the past 3 weeks. So the first 2 weeks was pretty much just doing microglia isolation. So the lab looks at how mom's immune activation influences fetal and infant brain development, right? So she then also looks at microglia. So it was a lot of just microglia isolations and techniques. And also I am now writing a manuscript. So, and it's on COVID-19, and my postdoc advisor, she established this COVID-19 biorepository where there's like placenta samples, fetal blood cord samples and whatnot. And so it's just a lot of being in lab, learning new techniques, and also writing. So that's the beautiful part about postdoc, is unlike being in grad school, you know, you have to take classes, you have to teach for funding, you also have to like worry about exams and also your dissertation. During postdoc, you can just focus on research and writing, and also preparing to write grants. So I'm actually really excited that Pete is here, because I'm going to be needing some help writing grants in a year. And so that's pretty much what a postdoc life is, learning new techniques and really diving into the literature, and also combining your PhD background with your current postdoc and trying to combine those two to figure out what you then want to do later on.
Yeah, I think, so I'm in the transition period right between Jessica and Rose. And I think maybe the best thing for me to talk about is like what I've been doing during COVID, and like how labs are kind of functioning a little bit differently right now. And so how to kind of shift what you would like have normally done in this like scenario. So our lab opened up back in June. And so as soon as lab opened back up, I had already made a calendar of exactly what day I would do what part of my experiment, so that I would be done in time for my defense. That was just the last week. Oh yeah, wow. This last week, it feels like it's been a really long time, but yeah, just last Thursday, I defended my PhD. So what I had done leading up to that was, you know, meeting with my committees, my reading committee, on what sort of edits or additions to make to my dissertation. So doing a lot of graph making, like I was talking about a little bit earlier, I've become pretty like forcibly proficient at Illustrator these last couple of months. So if anybody has questions about quick like tips on Illustrator, I could help with that. And then also been working on writing. So I wrote a grant with Garrett Stuber for NIDA, and we submitted a diversity supplement for his R37, and I got it. So that was super exciting. So very happy about that. And on top of all that writing, for the dissertation, the grant, I'm also writing the 2 research articles that I've been working on the past 3 years. I had recently submitted a paper that got rejected, unfortunately, but you know, this is a part of the process of science, is getting feedback and having to update and incorporate and kind of rethink about like, okay, how am I conveying my science and what can I do to make this more clear, or how can I represent the data in a way that is meaningful to audiences of these different journals. So I'm currently like revamping a paper. And then in just like the past 2 months, I learned a new technique. So, you know, it is sort of like a sprint, like Rose said, like all of a sudden you're just like, grad school in itself has been just like this roller coaster. You are constantly updating like what needs to be done and what to prioritize. And being flexible is probably, and adaptable is useful in these ways, but also like you're expected to be like the expert, but also you need to learn new things. And so, you know, you're taking on these different hats, but it's always good to take a step back and recognize that you're doing your best. And like, as long as you're getting there day by day, like that's what matters the most. So it can be really chaotic and a whirlwind, but at the end of the day, you're making progress every like day that you move forward. So that's kind of where I've been at in my transition between grad school and postdoc.
I think that's also like really important to note. Like it's going to be a ton of transition, so it's good to be adaptable in those situations.
Definitely.
Okay, so coming back to the title of this panel, I have a question on what is it like being Filipino, Filipinx, Filipina in the fields of neuroscience specifically, but also like how do you feel about representation of Filipino scientists in either your field or in the broader scientific field in general? It also touches upon one of the questions that an attendee has about how Filipinos are under the wider umbrella of Asian, and the representation of Filipinos in grad school is actually quite different from that. So if anyone has strong words or opinions or comments to make, feel free.
So I've always thought that, at least in my area, at least in my experience, Filipinos are underrepresented in probably at least in neuroscience. And you know, I had one graduate student who coincidentally was right across the hall from me. She was Filipina. Other than that, that was it at the University of Maryland neuroscience program. I will say though that when I went to the DoD, the Rear Admiral Raquel Bono, who I believe is the highest ranking in the US military, highest ranking Filipina, she was the director of the Defense Health Agency. So that was pretty amazing to see. You know, you look around at the other, you know, ethnic groups, and you see representation across them all, especially if we're talking about Asians in the sciences. But yet I think it's different, at least in my experience, as far as Filipinos. I personally never, at least I don't think, was treated differently based on, you know, being I'm Filipino American. I'm half Filipino, but you would see these communities because there's enough Chinese, there's enough Korean, often there's enough Japanese, where they kind of coalesce and form these little informal social groups at your university. And that obviously just wasn't happening with you know, me and my friend across the hall. So.
Yeah, and to add to that, I too have never really felt like I was treated differently because of being Filipino, but it does affect your views of belongingness if you really don't see anyone that identifies with you. You know, they may say they accept you, but that's, you know, just to see it every day is different. And I personally never knew that how much of an impact that would have on, you know, the feelings of like wanting to be motivated to continue to be in that environment. But I think that people don't really understand how Filipinos can be different from, you know, the other Asian ethnicities, because I mean, we have very, you know, different vulnerabilities as far as, you know, our health goes, and we have different socioeconomic vulnerabilities as well. And I think that it's important that we, you know, publish that more. I mean, there's even in COVID-19, Filipinos are at a higher risk of, you know, having really terrible outcomes for COVID-19 compared to other Asian races. And so I think that, you know, efforts like this and for us to come together and try to bring more visibility to us in this field and just in general will, you know, push us more towards, you know, not just being thrown under the big umbrella, the big Asian umbrella. But I'm looking at the question here now, and the attendee was asking about the NSF application and how you know, Filipinos are not really considered underrepresented minority. But I applied for the NSF also, I mentioned in the beginning, and so I still spoke about being Filipino and how I felt, you know, how I felt being a Filipino in science. So just because we don't have the label that would, you know, be formally considered underrepresented, just still speak on your experience and how you feel about that, because they do want to fund the person. They want to see you as a, you know, they look at these applications holistically. And so they want to, you know, understand your path and your journey. So definitely speak on being Filipino in science when you apply.
Yeah, well, just to echo that, back when I was in, when I was a postdoc, I was applying for a fellowship at the NIH, and it was at the time when Filipinos were no longer Pacific Islanders; they were Asians, and so they were no longer underrepresented minorities. I was shocked to hear and disappointed. But then I called the program officer at the NIH, and she told me explicitly exactly what you're saying, Jessica, is that, well, you know, please still bring that case forward, because they do look at the applicant. And, you know, let's look at the numbers, you know. Yeah, Asians are not underrepresented minorities, it's the opposite, but that's not the case for Filipinos.
Yeah, Brandy, did you want to go?
I was just going to echo, yeah, exactly what Jessica and Pete said, that I also added that I was Filipina in my NSF application as well, and, you know, emphasized that I didn't see many others like me in like graduate applications. Like when I was going for interviews, there's one other Filipinx person in the Princeton Neuroscience Institute, and we had one Filipina undergraduate research scientist come, but otherwise, yeah, I mean, I think that this is a problem just globally of wanting to lump and categorize specific races or ethnicities together in these bigger packages, and I think that that's not helpful. Everyone has, like Jessica said, holistic representations, and everyone has different experiences, and so although it might be easier to make these larger categories, it actually really does the opposite of what its intent is. So yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, I think during that time, I was at UC Davis, and there was actually this internship that was available to Pacific Islanders, and I wanted to apply for it. But then I think that might have been during the time when Filipinos were no longer considered Pacific Islanders, because I was at the office and I said, can we just double check really quickly? and the person actually Googled it and said, yep, no, you have to be Polynesian and whatnot. And so for me, being Filipino has influenced the type of science that I do. I focus a lot on children just because I was born in the Philippines and I've seen how poverty influences children. And so I very much see, or am trying to see, how we could then help children and mothers, especially those who are really dealing with poverty as well. Being Filipino also means for me being an immigrant and also a first generation, and also starting off as low SES. And so in all of my applications, I've emphasized all of those three things. And my PhD advisor actually applied for a grant, and I ended up getting the supplement diversity portion because of my background, because I said, I'm not sure if this qualifies because Asians aren't considered underrepresented, but these are all the things that I've had to deal with as a Filipino student. And just to reiterate what Brandy said, showcasing your upbringing and what it means to be Filipino, I think that really, truly helps.
This is sort of adjacent to what we were talking about, but I feel like for me personally, growing up, the Filipino part of like my representation was really Americanized. And my dad even, he was an immigrant from the Philippines, but he can no longer speak Tagalog because he didn't want to be picked on or teased for having an accent. And he grew up in a really hard area of Los Angeles. And so very much took on this like Americanized assimilation to the culture. And I feel like that also, was passed on to me. And so just recently I've been learning like a lot more about the culture and getting more involved with outreach like this. And so something like this has been really like good and invigorating for me.
So, I've often thought about this underrepresentation. And, my mom was from a tobacco farm in Pangasinan. And, she married my dad. He was a GI during the Vietnam War. It's a familiar story. And so she came over here, wanted to come to the US to give her children a better, life than she had on the farm. And I have cousins who were in Agoo, not far from where we were, where they were in Pangasinan. They excelled in high school. They excelled in college, computer science, whatever. A year later, she's in Taiwan at a factory slapping diskettes together. I have another cousin in Oman. I don't even know what she's doing there, but it's low-level manual work. And so I wonder, where is that, that pipeline? That pipeline seems to be wrong somewhere, because these were hardworking, talented people. And I think if they grew up in another country, they might not be in Oman right now, so I don't know if there's some sort of systemic thing going on where the system is just not, conducive to creating professionals instead of manual laborers.
There definitely, absolutely is a systemic issue in that the big thing is you hear stories, and I have family members and friends who they get a bachelor's in the Philippines, and when they try to apply here, the US doesn't consider their bachelor's as equivalent to a US bachelor's. And so somewhere in between, there is something going on that Philippine degree and Philippine education is not considered the same level as other countries. And I've actually had a meeting on Wednesday with Filipino scientists all over the world to talk about this exact same issue of how can we make science be better in the Philippines. But I think that there is definitely an issue that we need to address of that Philippine education is equivalent and it is worthy of wherever you go, it's still worthy. Because I have family, friends who were doctors in the Philippines, and when they came here, they're like, nope, not good enough. Or I had an uncle who was an engineer, he came here, and it's like, nope, can't practice here. And so he then needed to look for other jobs. And so I think that that's where it starts. And I'm so glad that you mentioned it. But yeah, there's definitely an issue.
Thank you for sharing. And also, it brings up the bigger questions of like, why do we need a community like AFSA? And in representation in this field, it's important to have such a big network of people because it shows you like you're not alone in these same sentiments. As we near the end of this panel, I'm going to round it off with what kind of advice or recommendations would you provide aspiring neuroscientists in any way, shape, or form? So like recommendations in terms of books or experiences or just some things that they can do or see or learn to figure out if this is the field that they want.
I can start. So first I want to say that it's not a prerequisite to want to be a Nobel laureate and to make a huge discovery. If that were the case, then a lot of us wouldn't even be in science. But I feel like a lot of people think, you know, there's a certain attitude about scientists where, oh, they must have been a straight A student. They must have been, you know, so bright from the start, and they just have these burning questions about the world. You know, that wasn't the case for me in the beginning. I had to really find what my interests were, and what was necessary for me was to immerse myself in it. But it took me a while to do that. I thought that I had to sit back and wait for that moment where I was just so passionate about science or something. I thought that was the prerequisite to pursue any career, that I had to be, that I had to, you know, have a bunch of knowledge about it before even getting into it. It's a weird thing that my brain does, but, you know, you just got to jump into an opportunity that you think is, you know, a little bit interesting, and you want to learn more. Don't be afraid to just, you know, cold call people, to email professors and ask for opportunities to do research in that lab. And you might find that you don't like it. Well, that's fine. At least you know you didn't like it and you can move on to the next. So just don't let the fear of rejection or the fear of not really knowing what you want stop you from pursuing, you know, going into science. I think that's probably the biggest barrier, going from being outside to in. But yeah. Well,
I was so smart, I could have got a Nobel Prize, but then where do you go from there? So I just kind of relax a little. No, you know, one thing I found amazing in grad school was that after the courses were done, we did 3 rotations in different labs, and then you were supposed to choose one. And you didn't realize it. That is a huge choice. I mean, it really carves your path. Are you going into, you know, sexually dimorphic development, or are you going into systems neuroscience, or are you going into genetics? And so, you know, you've now invested 5 or 8 years, whatever, on developing this expertise. It's really hard to shift at that point. So that one choice in choosing that initial lab is a very, very big choice. And so I would say, if I could give myself some advice from back then, is not only choose something that, you know, is really interesting from a scientific perspective, not just because you like the guy, but also look at the productivity of that lab. How long do they graduate students? And how many publications are they doing? Because you could be really set up to be ahead of the game, or you could be set up to need to catch up. Yeah, and the last bit of advice is, when you maybe find yourself in that I need to catch up stage, and you might be looking at other options such as companies, neuroscientists are exquisitely unprepared to work for pharmaceutical companies. Everybody else has done fax machines and, you know, they knew immunology and stuff. No company is going to say, we need an expert on learning and memory. You know, I found myself rather uncompetitive where that was concerned. And so these are things, you know, if you knew ahead of time from day one, you know, pursue your neuroscience that you love, but just be aware of what that is setting you up for as far as options or lack of options.
For me, it would have to be as proactive as possible. Don't wait for others to give you the opportunities. Look for them and search for them, and just be really, really proactive. And also to be, while I was on Filipino Scientists, there were a lot of messages about imposter syndrome and not feeling like they belong and whatnot. And my message to whoever, you know, messaged me about that is, you know, if you didn't belong, you wouldn't be there. But because you are there, then you do belong there because you've worked hard to be there. And so my advice is to just remain empowered and feel and know that you absolutely belong in your field. Grad school is a tough, it is tough, but it can also be a learning experience, not just from the science, but like a personal growth. You know, have thick skin and do what just needs to be done to get your work done. And also know that find a good mentor and good advisor. Anybody can be an advisor, but not all advisors are mentors. So it's really important to find an advisor and a mentor who will look out for your well-being and who will tell you, Rose, you may want to take a break and go home and get some sleep, you know. And so it's really important to be in a team of productive scientists, but also advisors who care about your well-being.
They never say that, by the way. Go home.
Mine did.
Okay.
During my dissertation defense, he mentioned, I'm like, oh no, don't say it. I was trying to finish as fast as possible. That's why I was like, I just need to be fast.
Yeah, I think what Rose said is where I was also thinking in terms of like mentorship. I think I owe a lot of my, like where I am now, and a lot of my like positive feelings now towards grad school and towards my journey to this point is because of good mentors. I really, and also off of what Jessica said, is like being really persistent and okay with cold emailing labs and just sending like casting a broad net, a wide net, because you never know. You might like have an idea of like what's interesting to you and what you really are like, like your interest is sparked by, but I would have never had thought that I would enjoy wet lab research as much as I do if I wouldn't have sent out a bunch of emails to all these different various labs. And finally, I only got one email back from a lab at UCLA, and that's the one I ended up joining. And honestly, the PI of that lab, his name is Thomas Miner. He passed away a couple of years ago, but he was absolutely the best mentor I could have had asked for as an undergrad. He really like spoke out for me and stood up for me and like wrote me some fantastic recommendation letters. And having someone vouch for you who's in a position that can like have a lot of influence is just so important. And so finding a mentor that you're compatible with and like recognizing that, especially like if you're doing interviews for labs, that's one of, I think, the most important things, and surrounding yourself with people who really support you and care about you and are going to tell you that you need to take a break because I know that feeling as well. You can get so zoned in and focused on a path and kind of put up these blinders and fail to recognize that you're a holistic being. You're not just this like person who needs to finish this histology to get this data to put in a paper to make one bar graph. So, you know, I think to just tell myself that as long as you're fulfilled and you're enjoying what you're doing, there's always going to be hard times, but to stay grounded and like be really genuine to yourself. I did see a question about low income perspectives on professionalism in research. And I think just to add to that is I have noticed how other people, like how myself is not reflected in a lot of other people I see around the department. And I think what I've told myself or how I've carried myself is just to stay genuine and grounded to me and not compare myself to other scientists, because we are all doing such niche things that there's no comparison to you. And so your path is just going to be unique, and being persistent and following that is, I think, the best advice.
Okay, well, I want to thank you. We've hit the 4 o'clock mark, so it's near the end. We just have a few announcements on AFSA's end. So I will screen share that. Okay. So coming up is the Global Day of Action Against the Killing of Human Rights Offenders in the Philippines. And if you've seen in media or Philippines news, a lot of issues have arisen in terms of human rights offenses, and then talking about that and also using our roles as scientists and leaders in the field to also shed light on these issues. So this will be an event open to anyone to attend if you'd like to. The registration is on here. You can take a screenshot and find these events online. This is hosted by Malaya. So it's another one of the bigger groups with other groups like Migrante and Defend Negros, which is across the United States. There's a lot of these groups, and they host these large events to both shed light and also educate like what is actually happening on the ground there, because we often don't see that in the news and don't hear that in the papers. On AFSA's end, we have weekly kamustahan. So those are just literally check-ins every week, Wednesdays at 7:30 p.m. You can see that on AFSA's page. Anyone and everyone can come. It's a great place to just meet people from AFSA, and then there's always someone from AFSA's like main board there, so you can kind of hear more about what we do and if anything new is coming up. A save the date, we have an anniversary official launch event coming up because AFSA is nearing its 1-year anniversary as an organization. So keep in mind that there's going to be something big in October. And if you haven't already and are interested in joining, this is the membership link, tinycc.action membership. And that's also a QR code that links you directly. So if you're looking at it on your computer, you can scan. It'll put you on our mailing list so you can get all of the updates. We have newsletters that go out that'll have information from things like this meeting, as well as any events that we host in the future. So that's a thank you on AFSA's end. If anyone else has anything to say, we have an open floor before we end off the webinar.
Thank you, Natalie, for organizing this and for all your questions.
Yes, great job.
And your flyers looked amazing.
Yeah. Can't say that enough.
Okay, but I think that is it. 4 o'clock on East Coast time.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you all for joining us. Tune in next time for our next webinar. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. It was a great time. Nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you all.